welcome to the 7th of our 8-week webinar series called Advancing in Predictive with Alteryx. Today, Dina Sanchez will be covering crosstab and transpose, and we actually only have one more webinar in this series, which will be in 2 weeks, November 21st, covering time series. Dr. J. Kyle Roberts will be doing this session. So if you're interested, make sure to go and register for that. And that will be on a Thursday at 12 p.m., just like our other webinars. A few notes before we get started. Yes, this webinar is being recorded and the link will be available before the end of the week. And we will have a Q&A session at the end, but you are more than welcome to input your questions into the Q&A panel as we kind of go along. A few introductions. My name is Rachel Mason, and I'm the marketing specialist here at Technion Data Solutions, and Technion is happy to be hosting this series. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Dina.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel. I really appreciate the introduction. And hi, everyone. Welcome back to our series on predictive analytics and data prep and blending to get ready for predictive. It's my privilege to be back again to talk about crosstab and transpose tools today. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, just a little bit about me. I'm a senior consultant at Technion Data Solutions, and I'm very privileged to be an Alteryx ACE or an Alteryx certified expert. I'm also very privileged to have won the Ace of Aces award this year at the Alteryx Inspired 2019 conference. You can actually see the competition on the Alteryx community website if you look for the Ace of Aces. I have been using Alteryx since way back when in 2005, so about 14 years now. And my degree is in geography and geographical information systems. So I do specialize in spatial and demographic analytics using Alteryx, along with other GIS software as well. I also am very privileged to be the author of Everything Happens Somewhere, which is an ebook and webinar series for Alteryx. You can find those on the technionusa.com website/video, or you can look for them at alteryx.com/resources. I've been leading the Dallas Alteryx user group for 5 years and founded the Fort Worth Alteryx user group last year. Our combined Dallas-Fort Worth Alteryx user group member count is now over 370. So I know some of our members are on the call today, and thank you for joining us and supporting the webinar series as well. So today we'll get into a lot more about data prep and blending in Alteryx. And if you've seen the other two series, I definitely love to say that it is a portion of all that Alteryx can do. And yes, it really does do it so well, as many of you current Alteryx users know. It really gives you that speed to insight very, very quickly, plus transparency, where you can actually see every step of the workflow and everything you're doing to your data within that workflow all at once. So again, today is about crosstab and transpose tools in Alteryx. If you're an Excel user, you may be familiar with this thought process by using pivot tables in Excel. So it's very similar to that. It is a way of formatting your data, of switching your data rows and columns wise. It's also a way that you can group data inside of the crosstab and transpose tools. You can kind of group your data together and then pivot that data for new insights into what you're looking for. As I mentioned with Alteryx, though, you get this wonderful transparency. You really get to see every step of the way of what's happening in the tools. And since you're actually going and running the tools in virtual memory, you can actually see what's happening as you transform your data without having to produce output to check and see what the results are. You can actually browse it using a small temp table tool called the Browse tool in Alteryx before you ever create output. And speaking of viewing your data and having transparency into what the crosstab and transpose tools are doing, you actually can use a before and after view, and I'll show you how that works today with both the crosstab and the transpose tool. It's called Browse Anywhere, and it's a wonderful feature of Alteryx to where you can see what's happening as the data goes into the tool and then what happens after the data comes out of the tool. Also with crosstab and transpose, you can use them together. They are not an end unto themselves, so to speak. There's actually really great ways of combining the crosstab and transpose tools, and I'll show that to you today as well, and much, much more. So I'll go ahead and get started, and I'll go ahead and switch over to my screen here. And let's see, I think I may need to be made a presenter on this one, just for a second. And hopefully it will change over. There we go. So now I'm going to show my screen. Thank you, Rachel. And I do have Alteryx up and running here. And I'm going to use a data set that you've probably seen before in some of the other webinar series I've done and in some previous ones in this webinar series. So I'm bringing in some customer data. It's just a customers.csv. And very simple file. I'm going to bring it down here because I'm going to do a few other things with it. You can see there's customer data here, a segment, there's a responder field of no or yes. Perhaps it's, say, to a restaurant and they had a marketing campaign and they were responding no or yes to a mail out or to a coupon or loyalty program or so on. And then you have their names and addresses and so on, longitude and latitude. So with this data, we're actually going to explore a little bit more with the crosstab and transform tools about the responder area. But first, I wanted to introduce these tools to you. These are in your transform category, and they're here under crosstab and transpose. So you can see the icons are very similar. So I usually have a mnemonic or a way of remembering which one is which. And the way I remember it is a transpose kind of looks like a T. It has a straight line across the top and then a line coming down. That reminds me, okay, that's the transpose tool. The other one's kind of like a C curve. So you have the vertical data going into the horizontal data, a little C curve. So that's how I remember crosstab and transpose. And hopefully that's a little tip and trick to help you remember it as well, especially when you've got it on your workflow canvas and you're trying to remember, oh wait, was that a transpose? Was it a crosstab? Which one was that? So that's just a little way of telling those apart. They're similar in that they pivot data, but they're also very dissimilar in many ways, and we'll go through those today on how the configuration is different for each one. But before we actually jump into those tools, we want to look a little deeper at the data first. And also, when it comes to crosstab and transpose, it's really important to begin with the end in mind. That's really a nice rule to go by with these tools. You kind of want to know what you want your data to look like at the end of the crosstab or transpose. And then you can then configure each of those tools to do exactly what you're looking to do with the data. So again, think of the end state you're looking for, especially with the crosstab tool. It's very important to kind of know, oh, I want my data headers to be like this. I want the values to be like this, and so on. And you'll see what I mean as I go forward today. Also, both of these tools sometimes need some configuration and some prep before going into the tools. So sometimes the data needs to be prepared first in order to pivot the data and make those pivot tables that you might be used to seeing in Excel. The same thing is true for Excel. Sometimes you need to summarize or group your data before you're making that pivot table. So the very same thing happens here. It's important to keep in mind that data prep and blending side before you actually transpose or crosstab the data. So with this customer data, again, it's always important to kind of know thy data as thyself, as I like to say. So we want to explore the data a little bit. I want to learn more about these responders. So I'm going to add a filter tool here. I'm going to just set up a basic filter, and I'm going to say responder equals yes. So I just want to count really quick of how many people responded yes and how many people responded no. If you're new to Alteryx, you'll notice that when I use the basic filter, it actually puts it into the correct syntax in the expression builder here with the brackets around the field name and then the quotes around the text. So just for those who are new to Alteryx, be assured that when you're using the basic filter, it's going to write the syntax for you. If you do a custom filter, however, you do have to type the syntax properly. There are resources in the Alteryx help online to let you know how to type that syntax. So I'm going to keep it as a basic filter, and then a little tip and trick. I'm going to right-click on the selected tool and just add all browses. This adds my browses perfectly aligned horizontally and distributed perfectly as well. So for those of you who do like to organize your workflows, that's a nice little tip and trick. Just right-click and add all browses, or you can click on the tool, and if you like hotkeys, you can do Control-Shift-B, and then that adds your browses. So I'm going to go ahead and run the workflow. And I'm going to look at the counts. So there are 430 with a responder of yes, and a little over 2,000 where the responder is no. So that gives me a little bit of insight into this data, especially when I want to look at how these are grouped per segment, such as corporate and home office, and how they're grouped by store number. So now that we've kind of looked at the data and figured out, okay, now we know the count of responders, I will give you a quick tip and trick on this. You'll notice that these numbers are showing up. These are the record counts and the file size as the data is coming through the stream. You can actually enable that to show all the time by going to your workflow configuration tools, click anywhere in your whitespace to get to the workflow configuration, and then on connection progress, click show instead of show only when running, which is a default. So click on show, and then it will actually show for that workflow. You can actually make this permanent and do options, user settings, edit your user settings, and then go to your canvas, and then where it says progress, show, change it to show. And then you'll have that as a default for every workflow that you build. And it's really nice to have, especially when you're using a lot of filters or sample tools, or you're working with large data sets. You really want to see those numbers coming through to let you know that your data is processing properly. So now that we've examined it, we're actually going to prep the data a little bit before we actually crosstab. So to do this, I'm going to bring in the Summarize tool. I want to actually make a pivot table of the count of responders of yes and no per segment per store number. So if you look back at the data, we've got all this extraneous data, the names, the addresses, and so on. We don't really need that for this pivot table. So sometimes the Summarize tool is a great way to actually not only summarize your data, but get rid of some fields that you don't need in your data stream. I was very honored to co-present at the London Alteryx Inspire Europe conference a few weeks ago with Mark Fish, as you all may know him as Marquee Crew of the Crew macros. And we presented on performance optimization for your workflows. And one of the things we talked about was removing fields early from your data stream that you don't need. This will speed up your workflow and improve your processing tremendously. And so a Summarize tool is a great way to do that. So again, I want to see the count of responders per segment per store number. So I'm going to reverse what I just said, and I'm going to start with the store number and group by. So I'm putting in a group by store number. Then I'm going to group by customer segment. And then I'm going to group by responder. So I'm going to have a responder for yes and a responder for no. I also want a count of responders. So the customer ID is the unique ID. So I can simply click on that and add count. So this is a hierarchical grouping. So we're grouping first by store number, then segment, then responder, and then getting a count of responders for each of these. So now that we have this together, I can add a browse tool and click run, and then you'll see the results here. So now I've got this count of segments, responders, and yes or no, and then per store number. So this is really nice because now I can see that for every segment, there are two responses. There's a no and a yes and a count. Then I have the next segment. If I scroll down, you can actually see there's 8 records. So there's 4 different segments per store. So the 9th record starts at store 101, starts again with consumer, and so on. So I've ended up with 8 different rows per store, 4 segments, and then a count of no or yes per segment. So maybe I want to pivot this data. Maybe I want to actually make a new header of no and yes, and then the count showing under that. So again, with crosstab and transpose, keep the end in mind. So to me, I actually want to see no or yes as a header. So that gives me a clue. I'm going to bring this down and go to my transform and bring in a crosstab. And the reason it's a crosstab and not a transpose is I'm taking this vertical data and I'm making it horizontal. I want no and yes to go across. So the crosstab is vertical to horizontal. So that helps me to imagine exactly how the data is going to appear. So I'm going to bring this crosstab tool here to the canvas. And then in the crosstab, you can actually group data. So I mentioned in the intro, you can group your data using the crosstab tool. This is where it happens. So I actually want to group by store number and customer segment. I want to keep these fields the same. I don't want to pivot them and make the segments the headers going across, although I could. But for now, I want to keep these the same and not pivot. Keep these the key fields. So I'm going to group them by these values. Over here is where I choose my headers. So I said I want no and yes to be new headers coming out instead of responder and count. So now I can choose my column header and I can say responder is my column header. I want the data that goes under each of these to be the values. So my value is count. And one thing to keep in mind with the crosstab tool is that there's only one drop-down here, one field for values. So when you're prepping data to go into your crosstab tool, keep in mind that all of your values need to be in one column before the pivot. So you may need to do some aggregation, some summation, or averaging and so on before you make this column with the values data. So that's very important to keep that in mind for the crosstab tool. Again, there's only one field that you can use for your values that will be pivoted. And that field here is the count field. So once I've got these together, I do need a method. So it gives you a nice little reminder, at least one method needs to be specified. And first I'm going to just do sum as my method for aggregating values. My values actually are unique per each one of the rows, so I don't really have any summation going on, but I do need to choose something as my aggregation method for the way the crosstab tool works. So I'm going to do sum, and then I'm going to go back and show you some of the other options in this. So I'm going to add a browse tool, and you'll see something happen after I add the browse. So now I've got no and yes pivoted, and now my values are within those fields. So now I only have 4 records per store number, 4 segments, and my no and yes values have now been pivoted with the responder as the header. So it was that simple to be able to do that. I could click on some browses and go back and forth between these, but if you look at the tools, and this is true not just for crosstab and transpose, but for every tool in the Alteryx toolset, there's often an input arrow and there's an output arrow. There are some tools that only have an output arrow, such as the input data tool, or only an input, such as the browse tool, but many tools, as they're going to be part of a stream, will have an input arrow and an output arrow. I can actually use this, and I love to use these with the crosstab and transpose tools because I can see before, if I click on this arrow, and then I can see after. So I can check and make sure that my crosstab and transpose is working the way I want it to work. I actually don't even have to add a browse right here. I can simply just click and say, yes, this looks right. I'm actually taking that responder field, pivoting it, but placing the count now in the data under each of the new headers. And now I have my counts appropriately. So I highly recommend using this browse anywhere whenever you're looking at your data in crosstab and transpose and adjusting as needed. These tools are so interactive. You can click and change things and practice with it and then use that browse anywhere to make sure it's working properly. Another way of looking at browse anywhere, instead of trying to grab these little arrows before and after, if you look at your results window, there's a dark input arrow icon here, And then there's an output arrow icon here. So I could just switch between the two views this way as well. So if you don't want to zoom in and try to grab those tools, you can actually just click on your input and output icons in your results window. So now I've pivoted the data. Here, I actually want to go back and show you something. So there may be times where you're building a report in Alteryx, and you may have wondered, how are people adding percentages to this data and making that a table? Or even more importantly, how are they adding totals at the bottom of the rows? You know, are they making a whole separate stream and putting totals on there? And yes, you can do that. There's usually more than one way of doing things in Alteryx, and that's one way of doing it. But you can use your crosstab tool to do that. So I'm actually going to go down here and I'm going to say, let's do percent row. Maybe I just want to calculate a percentage here. I'm going to go ahead and click run. And then look at the output. So here's my sum of no and sum of yes per segment, per store. And here's the percentage. About 85% are no, 15% are yes, and so on. This is already calculated for me in the crosstab tool. Isn't that pretty cool? It's kind of just hidden right down here in your method of aggregating values. You don't have to add a formula tool and create those calculations. It's a great tip and trick to have it done right here. I can also do a percent column, and this is going to show me hundreds, of course, in many ways. So here I have my X column for no and my X column of yes. All of these are going to add up for that percentage of 100. And then I can actually do totals. So I'm going to do total column first. And then you can see now I've got a total here, and this is a column that's being added, so hence total column. So now I've got my sum of no and sum of yes, total respondents per segment per store number. But again, what if you want to add that total row there in your reports? Just click total row, and here at the end, it looks like nothing's happened. Scroll down and you have a 41st record here, total, and then there's your total. Cumulative totals for no and yes. You can export this right as a table using your reporting tools and the table tool in reporting. So you don't have to add another formula, sum everything, and put this all together. It's embedded in your crosstab tool. It's really nice. So I hope that's a nice tip and trick to give you as part of the webinar series today. So another question is, what if I want to pivot this back? What happens with that? That's where you flip it again using the Transpose tool. So the Transpose is the opposite of crosstab. So I'm going to add a Transpose tool here. I'm going to take my data going across, my no's and yeses, and pivot them back to what they were originally. But there's something that's going to change when you use the Transpose tool. So with the Transpose tool, it actually outputs two columns. It outputs values and the name. So that's something to keep in mind when you're using the Transpose tool. It will actually create a name field and a value field. You can easily rename these. And we'll do that as part of this exercise really quickly. And then with my data fields, once it's refreshed and I push the data through the stream to the Transpose tool, now you can see there's a no and a yes as my data fields. Those are the fields I'm transposing. My key fields, store number and segment, are staying the same. I'm not pivoting those at all, but I am pivoting the no and the yes back. However, now I've got a name field and a value field. So this name and value field are actually the data that's being transposed. And it's very important looking at the value data. The Transpose tool will actually look at all values coming in. So here's the data that it was transposing. It will look at all values coming in, and it will actually find the optimal and most robust data type. Sometimes that'll usually be V-string if it's not all numeric. So something to keep in mind, if you have different data types coming in, into your transpose and it's being output as a value field, it will find the most robust data type for that data and then output it. So you may want to take a look at your data and look at your data types and see what it's being output as. It may not be exactly what you're thinking it is. So that's another tip and trick to keep in mind with the transpose tool. One way to see what those data types are is in your results window, click on metadata. So now I can see store number and segment are vstring 254. That's easy to assume because it's a CSV coming in. That data never changed. My name, though, is a string, and then my value is an integer, 64, with a size of 8. So that's a good way to look and see what your data types are. You can add a select tool if you want to and see your data types as well. Just to show what that looks like, I'm going to add one here. And you can easily see what your data types. But if you really want to just quickly look at them, just click the metadata button on your results window and you can get the metadata about the data coming in. I'm going to go back to data view and now you can see these have been pivoted back. So now I've got that name and that value. And now I have everything transposed and I simply want to pivot or actually rename these again so that I can actually say, okay, instead of name and value, I'm going to click on my select tool, go to rename. I'm going to call this responder. And then I'm going to change my value to count, just like it was before. I also want to let you know there is something a little different. You may have noticed here, because we have our counts on, that now there's a new count. So there were 79 coming out of the summarize, and there's 80 coming out of the re-pivoted data using the transpose tool. The reason for this is due to store number 102. Under consumer, it actually had a null value in the count there for yes. So originally there wasn't even a yes for store 102. There was just a no and a count. But when you pivot the data again, because the transpose tool is looking at all the values and all of the options for that no and that yes, if I look at store 102 consumer, in the cross tab, it has added a null value for yes because it does need something in that place there. So now I have 80 records. If I go back and I look at 102 in the original data after the summarize, there's only a field for no and a count. There's not a yes there. So that's why it's going from 79 to 80. So now you have this appropriately counted for, literally, in your data set. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're ever cross-tabbing and transposing and you notice a change in the counts coming out, research those and figure out why there is something added there. And that, again, that's transpose, looking at the values coming in for that no and that yes, and appropriately adding a null value for consumer responder equals yes. So it's definitely something to keep in mind there when you're looking at your data. So this was a very simple exercise about crosstab and transpose. I'm going to show you next, I've got, in the interest of time, 3 other workflows already pre-built, but I'm going to explore what's going on with those. So I have this one here, which is a crosstab and transpose of monthly data. So I've got some pet store data, monthly sales here, and you can see the sales are by month as I scroll across, and then there's a total field. So what if I want to actually look at this data and transpose the months? What if I don't want the months going across, but I want them going vertically? So again, that transpose tool, take it from across and go vertical. So I'm going to actually look at the data and first sort it on total sales in a descending manner. And the reason I'm doing this is I just want to pick the top 5 just so it's easier to see what happens with that transpose tool and that crosstab tool as well. So to pick the top 5, I've got a sample tool here. First in rows where n equals 5. And because I've sorted on total, I now have my top earning pet stores here. So again, if I want to transpose that data, taking all the monthly data and making it vertical, I simply use a transpose tool. So I'm going to keep name as the key field, and then I'm going to deselect the rest of the key fields I don't need. Again, the Transpose and Crosstab tool is great for taking some fields out of your stream and optimizing your workflow. The data fields are where I actually want to transpose the data. So these are the ones that are going to pivot all of the months here. I'm going to remove total as well for my key fields. So as mentioned, I can click on this input arrow and this output arrow to see what happens with the pivot. And again, with the Transpose tool, it outputs two fields, name and value. These are two fields in addition to any key fields you check. So as many key fields as you check, you will have two additional fields output for your data fields, name and value. So it's important to keep those in mind when you're using that Transpose tool. So with this, now I've got my name and value. It's added it as name too because I do have a name for the store here. And you can see that it scrolls through, and for every new store, it starts again with January all the way through December and so on. So it's really interesting whenever you use Crosstab and Transpose. Transpose will transpose your monthly data in order, but Crosstab performs a sort. So that's something to keep in mind, and there's a workaround for that, especially when you're using monthly data and you want to keep all of these in order starting with January and February. So we'll see what that looks like. But now you can see the values have all pivoted. I can actually use a select tool and just rename here. My name to is now month. My value is sales, appropriately so. And then I can actually sum the sales for the month if I cross-tab it back. So again, you want to keep the end in mind with the cross-tab. So with the cross-tab, I'm actually taking the month and I'm going to take the name of the store and make that my header. So here's the original view. Sometimes it's hard to grab that input there. The original view here is the name of the store. Here's my month and here's my sales. So I actually want to make my new headers name. I want to spread the name of the store going across as headers. I want to keep sales as my data values, and I want to group by month. So again, keep the end in mind of what you want this to look like. So when I'm configuring my crosstab tool, I'm going to group by month. My new column headers are going to be name, or the name of the store. These will be going across. And then I'm going to populate the sales data under each of these stores per month. So whenever I say per month, that's a hint that it's a grouping field. Maybe I want to do this per customer segment and per store. So as we saw in the other workflow, that's your grouping field. I want to actually make these sales per month. So I'm going to group by month. So here I've got this checked. My new column headers are name. My values are sales. It does need some method for aggregating the values. So I'm going to click and leave this at sum. Also, your methods will change based on the data type coming in. You're going to see this in one of the next workflows, but it will change for you just like a summarize tool changes. And so my values coming in are numeric. So I have options for average, count, percent, and so on for these sales values. If these values were string, I would have concatenate, min, and max, or some other data that I could use, but concatenate is a good default for string values. So now that I click on the output, you can see here now these 5 stores are going across. It's per month, and then the values are here. So I've only got 12 months in the data, but the crosstab does sort based on your grouping data. So these are not in order anymore. And what's a good workaround to do that? This is one reason I included this in this webinar is I get a lot of questions about this. How do you get this back to that nice January, February, March order that we use here? One way to do that, and there's actually more than one way, so I'm going to show you 2 ways in this workflow. You can first convert the month to a datetime. So your month value or your month format is actually in a %B format. I know you may not be able to see that too well in this, so I'm going to open up Notepad and I'm going to put this expression in Notepad for you. So it is a datetime parse formula. It's a very simple formula, but highly useful. And I'm parsing the month, and I'm using %B so I get the full spelling of the month. This %B is denoting my input data. This is what my input looks like. If you want to know more about date parse formats, you can look on the help in Alteryx, and there's a whole plethora of formats available for you to view and figure out and even memorize these wonderful formats, such as %Y is a 4-digit year. So when I'm doing a datetime parse, it's going to turn it into a date format. I've changed my data type into date with a size of 10. And whenever you do a formula right in the formula tool, you get a nice preview of record 1. So here's my preview. This is in a true datetime format. This is going to be in the year and then the month and the day with the dashes. So I've converted this to month for this month output. This is called month 2 here in my results window. So next I'm going to use another formula to get the month out of here, out of the middle of this, and I'm actually going to change this and use it as the order to sort by. So one good way to do that is actually one of my favorite expressions, a substring expression. So I'm going to perform a string expression called substring. This is in your functions or the FX button. You can actually scroll down and click on string and then use substring. So substring is here. Whenever you hover over any of these formulas, it gives you a little hint about how to do the counting for the data. Substring is actually zero-based. So substring is more of a positional type of count. So any position type of count, such as get word and so on, as we have here, this is actually an nth or zero-based word in the string. So you start counting at 0. Character-based, such as left and right and so on, start counting at 1. So whenever you have a left and you're looking for the first left characters of a string, you'll start counting at 1, 2, 3. However, with substring, it is zero-based, something to keep in mind, and you start counting at 0. So in my substring, I'm using month 2, which I generated here just above. And then my start point is 5. And it's 5 because if I start counting at 0, that 1400 default here is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3. So the dash is 4 and the 0 for the month is 5. So I want to start my substring at position 5. Again, it's position based. And then I only want 2 digits. So it's a 5, 2. So I'm going to put this back up into Notepad for you to see that really easily. So again, I'm doing substring on the new field I generated, month 2. My position starts at 5 because it's a zero-based count, and then I only need 2 digits to get the month out of there. So now I have a new field called month order. And now April is appropriately labeled as month 4, August is 8, December is 12, and so on. So now I have a way of ordering the data. I can now add a select tool. I'm going to just rename these fields because something else to keep in mind about crosstab is in order to improve efficiency in processing, the crosstab tool will add underscores for spaces or any other punctuation. So if you have an ampersand and so on, it's going to add an underscore. So that's something to keep in mind. You may want to rename your fields after the crosstab. So I've simply renamed my fields here, and then I've deleted month 2 out of the stream. I don't need that anymore. That was just for calculations of finding the month using substring. And so now I have my month order. Now I can simply sort on month order in an ascending manner, and now everything is back to normal. Now I've got January through December with my month order here, and then all of my data appropriately pivoted. So I mentioned there is another technique you can use among many to actually figure out and sort those dates. I could actually simply create kind of a lookup table using a record ID and then just join that data and then sort on that month order. So one way to do this is I'll actually go here and I'm going to add a sample tool right after my transpose tool. So you can see in the sample or here, the first 12 out of all of these is going to be the months in order. So anywhere I've got my months in order, I can use this technique. So I'm going to add a sample. I'm going to connect it right here, bring it to a new stream. I'm going to say, give me the first n rows where n equals 12. And then I'm going to add a record ID field out of the preparation category. So here's record ID. I just want 1 through 12. Pretty simple, but there's going to be a few configurations I'll make. So I'm going to call this month order, just like before. Keep my starting value as 1. I'm actually going to change my type to a string, size 2. And I'm going to keep it a string so I can actually join later. Physician's first column, but because I'm going to join this data, I'm just going to make it a string for now and a size of 2. So I'm going to add a browse and take a look at what that looks like. And then I have a month order. And since my months are already in order, this record ID is a technique you can use to do that. So now I'm going to just add a join. So I want to join on name 2, which is my main month name. And then I want to go back and join that to month with my data here. So I'm going to bring in a join tool, bring this browse down a little, and just bring in a join. And with my join, I'm going to bring it from the crosstab because here I have a month column. So I'm going to bring in the crosstab in on the left, and then I'm going to bring this in on the right. I'm going to say here on the left, we'll join by month. Here on the right, we want to join on name 2 because name 2 was that column that had the actual month name in it. We're also going to deselect everything but the month order on the right because we don't really need these names and values. We're really just joining to join that month order there. So I'm going to take these off. We actually have all the values already cross-tabbed into the data. And so now I can add a browse here. I can right-click and add all browses. And then click Run. You've got 12 coming out. Now you have a month order appropriately assigned for each of your months. And then you simply take a sort tool here, just like before. And then you simply sort on month order in an ascending manner. And then now you've got your data back in line with all the months appropriately in order there. So those are another tip and trick, another way of actually creating these assigned month orders, especially when you are doing crosstabs with monthly data or even data which is like days of the week or something like that. Keep in mind your crosstab is not only going to sort data coming out, but it's also going to add underscores into your headers just to improve processing time. So that's just something to keep in mind there. I'm now going to show you 2 other workflows. So there's something pretty cool about crosstab and transpose, and these are pre-built in the interest of time here. If you are using a lot of JSON data, if you're scraping web pages and the pages are in JSON or JavaScript, you are actually going to have to use some way of actually transposing that data after you parse it. So the crosstab tools are actually going to be your best friends when it comes to JSON data. The crosstabs are heavily used and they're so efficient when you're actually pivoting this crosstab or this JSON data. So I'll show you what this looks like. I've got some JSON data here. JSON, if you've used it before, it actually comes into this as columns of the name and the value string. You can see here, I've got column names, .0, .1, and so on. So I've got 10 column names. These are actually going to be the column names once I pivot the data. If I scroll down in my JSON data, I've also got data, .00, 0.1, so on. So the 0, the first digit, is actually going to be corresponding to my column. The second digit corresponds to the data values. So that's something to keep in mind. You can see here with data 0.0, it's a date. And then if I go down to 1.0, it's another date, and so on. So if I go back up to my columns, column names .0 is my date field. So I need to be able to pivot all of this. So one thing I can do is actually separate column names from data. And an easy way to do this is use a filter. I'm going to say, give me the left JSON name, 6 digits on the left that equal column. I'm going to put this up in the notepad for you to see really quickly. So that way you can see I'm just taking the left 6 characters and will they equal column. And out of that comes these characters. So now I have column names 0 through 10. These are going to be my headers. So what's left over is actually going to be used as data, and I'll show you how that works as well. So with the data, whatever's left over out of this filter, which is one reason to use a nice Boolean filter like this of true and false, the false output, I now can do the very same thing. Give me the left JSON name 4 characters where they equal data. And so now I've got these. I can say find what's left and what equals data. And now I've got all of these records that start with data, data 00, 10, 20, and so on. I need to be able to parse and pivot this data as well. The key word is pivot, which is going to be the crosstab. So first I do need to parse the data. So when I'm looking at the column data, you can see here for column names, dot 1, 2, 3, and so on, I can simply add a text to columns tool, split this JSON name into 3 columns. So now I have name 1, name 2, and an empty name 3. So now I can say, oh, okay, these are my column names 1 through 10, or really 0 through 10 there. I can actually add just a formula to flag this column. I'm going to group it by 1 because the crosstab tool needs something to group on. As an Alteryx ace, I can also say that you don't have to group on it. You can actually bypass that. It depends on what you want your data to look like. But for the most part, you will need to group values in the crosstab tool. So that's why I've added a field called group. I'm using this as my field to group on. And in my crosstab, now I'm going to look at the before and after. So before, I want to take these value strings and make these my headers. And then I want to take the value and actually switch these over. So I'm actually using the crosstab and saying, let's make JSON name 2 my headers first, because we're doing this to join with the data here at the bottom, because that data has a 0, a 1, and a 2, and so on. So again, begin with the end in mind. I want to make sure that this JSON name 2 is my header first, and then my values are going to be the value string. So in my crosstab configuration, I'm grouping by my group number. Again, that's just a placeholder added there. My new column headers are JSON name 2, 0 through 10. My values for the new columns are going to be value string, my actual headers. I'll show you what happens later, and you can move those up later as true headers afterwards. My method for aggregating values, I'm now, because it's a string, get concatenate first and last. So I'm going to leave it as a default of concatenation, but you can actually use other separators for your concatenation. You can add pipes, quotation marks for key pairs, and so on. So now I can see what happens at the end. Now I have my group. I have 0 through 10 as my headers, and now my headers appropriately pivoted. So that was really easy in this crosstab tool. Going back to the data side of things, I've filtered out everything that doesn't start with data on the JSON name, all these extraneous headers from the web page, and now I have just data. Same technique. I'm going to use a parse, the text to columns tool. I'm going to split on a delimiter of period for a JSON name into 3 columns. And now I get name 1, data, name 2 is the actual column header, name 3 what corresponds to the data. So my value string is actually the data. So now I've got these actually parsed out. So now I can actually pivot. What I want from my pivot is the 0 through 10 to go across the top, just like I'm doing here, 0 through 10. And I want my values to be in the data values. So keeping the end in mind, I want these 0 through 10 to go across the top. So I always start with my headers whenever I'm configuring my crosstab tool. It's just a personal way of looking at things. I want my headers to be name 3. I know that name 3 is going to be my header columns here. So JSON name 3 is here. My values are going to be the JSON value string. So now I have values for the new column, JSON value string. And I simply want to group by name too. I don't need all this other information. I'm just going to group by zeros, then ones, then twos, and those are going to be my records coming through the data. I don't need the original JSON name and all of that. So in the crosstab, I'm not going to group by them. Grouping by name 2, new headers of name 3, value string, concatenation, and now these are pivoted appropriately. Now I have my columns, but these are not in sort order, actually. Again, the crosstab will sort in a certain type of order here, the numeric order, but now I need to actually do a true sort as well. So now that I've got my data pivoted, I'm going to add a select and look at the data here. I'm changing this JSON name 2 to an integer 32 for a union. And I'm going to sort by name 2 in ascending manner. So here's my name 2. Now these are appropriately in order. And now I have all of these together. So now this is looking familiar. I've got a group column 0 through 10. I've got a name column 0 through 10. I can union these together, putting the column on top, simply using autoconfig by position. It's pretty easy to do that because I know I've got one column here, then everything in order. I've got another column here, everything in order. I can simply auto-config by position. And then you can see with my output, now I have my group and those JSON names. Here's my actual headers, but now they're all lined up under that 0 through 10 very appropriately. I simply add a select tool, take the group off, and then magically use the dynamic rename tool, which is in your developer toolset. And so dynamic rename is extremely useful. Use the dynamic rename, make your mode take field names from first row of data, make sure all your fields are selected, and now as your output, now it's moved the field names from here on record 1 up to the actual headers. So now you started with this JSON data, quite jumbled, it's all in columns here, and now you've ended up with a tabular data that now you can perform analytics on. In the interest of time, I'll switch over to one more just so you can see. I've got some data here that's in a spreadsheet in an Excel file. And sometimes in Excel files, you may have really nice looking Excel files. You've got data that people have added headers and so on. And I'm going to just auto-fit these columns here. You can see here, I've got a bunch of headers here for Chobani yogurt. Then I've got headers for Dannon, the same headers start again, and so on. And I also have a company name, and then the new company repeats. So if you were pulling this into Alteryx, this could be a little bit of a headache, actually. So how would you actually turn this into a row and column format without all of these null values? So you can use crosstab and transpose to do that, plus a bunch of the other tools here, like a multi-row formula. So I'm taking this data, I'm actually doing a multi-row formula to say if the left columns in F1 start with week, then use the company before. So here, I'll show what that looks like. So I've got a week ending and I've got the data here. And I'm actually going to take the company name here for F1. I'm creating a new column named company, and then it's going to populate this company name for anything starting with week for the row above. I can go into this in another webinar series of how this wonderful tool works. I love the multi-row and multi-field formula tools. But now I've got the data. Here's the company name, and now the company is associated with that week. So now that I'm looking at the week data, maybe I want to actually transpose this. Maybe I want to actually take it and switch it to where the company name is here and I have values here. So one way to do that is keep the record ID as the key fields and F1, which is my weeks, and then transpose everything else. Now I've got names and values. I'm going to join on this function here, or F2 numbers. There's also an option where if I'm looking at my headers, and I want to get rid of null values, I can actually assign all of these using a transpose tool and then a multi-row formula. So I'm adding a transpose. I'm saying keep the record ID the same, pivot all the other records. Now I've got all these field names, but with null values. I can add a multi-row formula tool to say, if the value is null, then use the value of the row above and populate it. So here's the before. If this is null, use the value before and populate, and so on and so on. And now it has populated it. Every time that the actual data changes for the company, it starts with that one and moves forward. So again, your transpose tool can be really useful when you're actually needing to get rid of null values. Transpose the data from what it's doing before going horizontally, make it vertical, add the multi-row formula tool to get rid of null values and populate it with something else, and then go back and cross-tab it again. So now we have the crosstab tool. We're having a new record header of record ID. And now I've got a record ID of 1 and 2. Now I have my headers appropriately assigned per yogurt type. So again, you can use that transpose tool and the crosstab tool all together back to back. So I've joined the data. Now I've got all of these weeks together. I can actually join on the name, which is the function here for each of these, that F2 and so on for the field name. One more crosstab to pivot my data. Here is the before. On this one, I have all my data here for the companies, and I want my field names to go across. So in the crosstab, I always think of what do I want my new headers to be? I want my new headers to be the field. I want these to go horizontally and not vertically as they are right now. My values will be the value column. Again, with a crosstab, it needs to all be in one column. There's only one option for your new values. And then I'm grouping by week, company, and item. So now here's my output. I'll open that in a new window for you. Now I have the week ending here. It's grouped by company. There are 4 yogurt types per company. And now my new fields are going across instead of vertically. And my data is appropriately assigned per field, per item, per company, and per week. Now I've got something tabular I can actually perform analytics on, and not a very interesting and well displayed Excel file that has a lot of null values and a lot of groupings that would be hard to actually perform analytics on in Alteryx. So now it's converted into this. So I know we're really close to the hour. I had a lot to show you today. I will open it up for any questions, but again, any questions that I'm not able to answer, Rachel will forward to me, and then I can answer those offline as well. So I did want to open it up for questions, and I also wanted to put in a plug because next week is the Tableau conference in Las Vegas. And if you are going out to Tableau, please visit the Technion booth. It will be booth number 536, and you'll get to meet Rachel and a lot of the other Technion staff there, including Dr. Kyle Roberts, our resident data scientist. So again, feel free to stop by if you are in Tableau next week. Again, I want to open it up for questions.
Sure. I think we have time for maybe just one. And then, like Dina said, I will share all these questions with her and she will reach out to you personally. But this question is, can you download out of the arrow field, and can you download from the arrow on the crosstab arrows into an Excel sheet?
Ah, that is a good question. I don't believe you can download straight from them. You can copy to the clipboard. So from the input and output arrows, you can actually copy. But if you do need to download straight from them, simply add a browse tool, and then you can actually save straight from the browse, which is a really nice feature. So I can actually open these as new records, and then there's my export button, and I can export all records and then do a save as straight from the browse tool. So you actually don't have to put an output tool onto your workflow to do this. If you like what's happening in your crosstab and transpose, simply add a browse and save straight from there as well.
Well, great. I think that's all the time we have today. Like we mentioned, in 2 weeks, we will have the final webinar of this series. Dr. J. Kyle Roberts will be covering time series. But thank you for so much for joining us today.
Thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you at our user group meetings and at various Alteryx events around the Metroplex. So thank you again for joining.